Why haven't I heard more about this book? Maybe it's because most movie tie-in books are totally lame? Could be, but in this case it really isn't. Seriously, this is a great book in Arthur C. Clarke's bibliography. Special delivery, the extended edition of 2001. Actually, that's a pretty good description. In some respects, you can think of this as 2001, the extended edition. And it's not because this is a longer version of the novel, it's because there are 33 deleted or alternate scenes that Arthur C. Clarke cut out while he was writing 2001. So, where's disc 2? It's a book. This book was written in 1972, and it's basically about the development of both the film and the novel at the same time. And what's interesting is that by then, 1972, the Apollo program was already in the process of being shut down. But when Clarke and Stanley Kubrick were developing 2001 in the latter half of the 1960s, they had a huge problem. They were trying to outguess the future. They didn't want just another science fiction movie. How about giant ants invade America? Yeah, not that. They wanted to make the proverbial good science fiction movie. And they wanted something that wouldn't feel obsolete by the time the movie came out. At that point in time, the Apollo program was in full swing and man still hadn't landed on the moon. So how do you solve that problem? Well, they eventually decided to base it on Clarke's 1948 short story, The Sentinel. It's a really nice little story, and the full text is in here because it's only about 10 pages long. It's basically about this guy on the moon. It's told in first person. He's in this expedition and he sees something and he goes and investigates it. And he discovers it's this alien artifact. I can't actually recall what happens in the end. Most of it is fairly expository. Yeah, but you can clearly see the seed of what would become the idea of 2001. So the first part of this book is made up mainly of journal entries by Arthur C. Clarke over about a 2-year period developing the ideas behind the novel and the movie. And it's packed with all sorts of fascinating little details. For example, the monolith wasn't originally a monolith. It was going to be this tetrahedron, basically a four-sided pyramid shape. And apparently they kept trying different versions and nothing seemed to be quite right. And eventually they settled on the black slab that we all know. Good decision. Imagine if they'd chosen to go with the giant space Toblerone. Another cool detail, the first shot that they filmed was not the dawn of man, any of that sequence. It was the astronauts finding the monolith on the moon. And that was filmed in December 1965. There's even a reproduction in here of the original call sheet for that first day of filming. And what's amazing is that at that point in time, most of the major parts of the story hadn't even been worked out. And what's also funny is that 6 months later, in July 1966, Clarke thought that the novel was finished and ready to be published. But Stanley just kept wanting changes, rewrites, all sorts of idea changes. And it wasn't published until 2 years later in July 1968, which was a few months after the film came out. Another couple of little stories scattered in the journals. Kubrick, when he does that famous cutscene of the bone becoming the spaceship, they just finished filming the ape sequence where the bone is used as a weapon. And as they were walking back to the studio, Kubrick was just kind of throwing the bone up and down in his hand. And he thought, wait a second, and he grabbed a handheld camera and just started filming these throws up into the air. And thus one of the greatest edits in film history was born. Another funny anecdote, the Oscar for Best Makeup that year went to Planet of the Apes. I mean, really? When you look at the two side by side, compare the ape makeup in these two different films. Clarke jokes that maybe the Academy judges thought they used real apes in 2001. So that's all the journal stuff. And then we get on to all the deleted material. There's stacks of stuff here, like whole chapters that were cut. For example, at one point there was an idea about the aliens who put the monolith on the Earth. Instead of just dropping it there, they visit Earth and hang out there for 5 years. And in this very slow and deliberate way, they start teaching the hominids there these lessons to kind of kickstart their higher order thinking. For example, teaching them how to use a bone as a weapon to kill. And only after that do they then put the monolith on the moon. Also, as an aside, the book talks about the Stargate on the planet Jupiter that the aliens use as this kind of gateway travel system. There's another large 7-chapter section which was meant to get people, the readers, or potentially the moviegoers up to speed with the technology involved. For example, they introduce Hal, who in this version is actually called Socrates, and he's a full-on robot at this point in time. And they describe processes like cryosleep and all that sort of stuff. It even quotes Asimov's 3 laws of robotics. One whole chapter is about the space agency trying to educate the public about distances in space. And it has a person narrating basically the Powers of 10 video. And you also learn about the backgrounds of all the astronauts that come together for the mission. Like some of them are from various places, like they're in orbit around Venus. And they all come together for this discovery mission. It's also fascinating to hear Clarke talking about what was going on at the time of writing. When he's talking about the design of the ship and how its propulsion would work, he mentions the idea of slingshotting the craft around Jupiter to get to Saturn. And as an aside, he mentions it as a variation of the Grand Tour concept that was used by the Voyager probes. Except he's writing this in 1972. And he's mentioning how that will be possible in 1976 due to the alignment of the planets that won't happen for another 200 years. And he really hopes they're going to be able to use this concept. And here we are living in the future of that moment. We then get 15 chapters of a different version of the story, proceeding from the launch of the Discovery all the way to the crew discovering the Stargate on the 5th moon of Jupiter. And there are a couple of deaths along the way. Reading parts of this, I actually felt like I was reading Andy Weir's The Martian. And of course, that should be the other way round. The Martian should be reminding me of Clarke. I guess what I'm saying is, if you like The Martian and Andy Weir, I think you'd enjoy 2001 and Arthur C. Clarke. Then we get 3 alternate endings. The first one continues with more of the crew alive, and in the other 2, Clarke and Kubrick had started to get the idea that maybe just one of the characters should survive, i.e. Dave Bowman. And they all contain detailed descriptions of all these strange alien cities and creatures, and it was obviously totally unfilmable with the technology of the day. So, would I recommend Lost Worlds of 2001? Absolutely. Even I liked it. If you've never seen the film, probably start with that. Then read the book. I highly recommend reading the book. It fills in so many details that you don't get watching the film, especially that ending. And then read this as well. Let me know in the comments if you've read this. I will see you in the next video. So, still no disc 2? No, still no disc 2. Worth checking.